This short tutorial is designed to make us think a little bit about states, what we mean by states, sovereignty, states in the international system, authority, legitimacy, these things that matter for how we think about states as states. What does that word mean? So states and nations, these are not the same things. Max Weber's definition is states have a monopoly over the legitimate use of force within a given territory. So we can think of places where states have not been able to achieve this. Somalia, the failed state during the late 90s and 00s, a government that did not have monopoly over the use of force in its own territory. Lebanon historically has had a situation where a large group, the Hezbollah, had an armed militia that was not controlled by the national government and had control over a piece of territory in that country. But overall, typically, when we think about a state, it is the administrative entity with the monopoly over the legitimate use of force in a given territory. Nation, however, that's more of a group of persons who share an identity that is based on, but not limited to, shared ethnic, religious, cultural, linguistic qualities. Shared territory might be significant, but not necessarily so. So the Jewish nation, for instance, is a community that's spread over the world, really. So these two should not be conflated with each other. State is not the nation, and a nation is not a state. The nation-state refers to the idea of building a state based on a single nation, which is a problem. And it has led to a lot of conflict and political reorganization throughout history. So, on the one hand, it led to unification movements in Germany and Italy, revolutionary movements of its day. And on the other hand, it led to the breakup of Yugoslavia and the issue of national self-determination was one of the key issues talked about in the Versailles Peace Treaty negotiations. And a problem is that if you take any given state, you will find that it is not confined to a single nation. France, for instance, in the south, there are Basques and Catalonians who live in both the territory of the French state and the Spanish states. The United Kingdom is definitely not a nation state. It's a state that contains Welsh, Scottish, English, and Irish. Even a country like Sweden, that is seen very often as a homogeneous nation state, is not homogeneous. The Sápmi indigenous population has lived there for as long as the Swedes, and the Roma population has lived there for a long time as well, centuries, and so on. So just about in any case, even the Japanese state, where you have minorities in the north and in the south that are not of Japanese ethnicity, and so on. So a single state doesn't contain a single nation, and attempts to create a state based on a single nation tend to lead to a lot of strife and conflict, and in the case of ex-Yugoslavia, ethnic cleansing, so human rights abuse by the majority on the minority. So it's important to not conflate state and nation. Sovereignty, then. For a state to be considered sovereign, it has to be recognized by other political authorities as the legitimate and rightful state actor. So that means that it internally exerts control and externally is recognized by other states. No other international actor may override rights of self-determination authority within the territory. That's a principle of international lawmaking, just about, with some reservations. But generally speaking, there is an idea of non-intervention. And this goes back to the history of sovereignty. If you look through the Middle Ages, the age of feudalism, many different conceptions of political authority existed then. Imperial states, you had city-states, you had principalities. The point was that the sovereign was vested in a single person. So the king was the sovereign. It wasn't a sovereign country, it was a sovereign person. But this changed over time. So in 1648, there's a 1 here behind the picture, the Treaty of Westphalia, the birth of modern sovereignty. The Westphalian system recognized the sovereign rights of the states. The state had monopoly of power over territory, people, and resources. And that is the time when we really see how the idea of sovereignty moves from a person to an institution. And this has implications for domestic policy and international policy. So what is a state allowed to do within its own borders? We've seen some egregious examples of what states could do to its own citizens and say, well, national sovereignty, this is none of your business, including genocide. So that has been challenged again, this idea of national sovereignty, and also by building international bodies of governance, which will be covered later in a different tutorial. By building international bodies of governance, sovereignty has changed. There are institutions like the United Nations or the EU where states agree to pool a little bit of their sovereignty together. So the United Nations Security Council can, in fact, use force against a member state if there is a risk that there will be a genocide there. So sovereignty today has been challenged by new actors, including organizations and corporations that can move around. They're still the primary unit of analysis in international relations. But sovereignty, the way you think of it in the 21st century, is not to be held captive by the idea of Westphalian sovereignty, because there are a lot of problems with the idea of one state having complete control over its territory and being completely without interaction with other states. The movement of people and goods, the economy, and the ability to hold states accountable depend on them not being above the laws, even international laws. We can talk here about authority and legitimacy. Power or right to force obedience, authority, individuals or groups are given certain rights and responsibilities to lead the political system. And legitimacy, the lawful, appropriate, and conforming to the standards of a political system. So you could say that that the state is the entity that can use force with legitimacy within a given territory. But the question is if it should have the authority to do so. So this is an issue of how you maintain legitimacy and how you maintain authority. On what should legitimacy be based and what should authority be based? These questions are really important to determine what should be the criterion for sovereignty. So that's an overview of states in the 21st century, things to think about. What is the claim to authority? What is the claim to legitimacy? How do we think about sovereignty in the international system today?